The UK is under fire as it announces a new plan for asylum seekers. It says the goal is to crack down on illegal immigration. Critics say it's a breach of international law. So how will this affect those who seek safety in the United Kingdom? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the program. I'm Hashem Ahelbarra. It's been described as the biggest overhaul in the UK asylum system in decades. The government says it wants to stop people smugglers from bringing thousands into the country illegally every year. But those who advocate for migrant and refugee rights say the changes are unjust. They insist refugees should not be punished for taking all available routes as they seek safety. But the British government insists people should do all they can to enter the country through legal means, and it will make it harder to obtain residency for those who reach its shores illegally, including limiting their ability to sponsor family members and apply for benefits, while asylum seekers who enter the UK legally will now be given an immediate right to stay. We'll bring in our guests in a moment, but first, this report from Nadeem Baba in London.
Well, Priti Patel is saying the aim of these proposals is to fight people smugglers and to save lives. It boils down to a two-tier approach, really. The government's saying that refugees who arrive here in the UK through what they call legal routes will be given direct access to the asylum system, whereas so-called illegal arrivals, people who often cross Europe, pay people smugglers to cross the English Channel, won't have the same rights. It's understood the government wants to be able to try for a period of around 6 months to send them to other countries before having to look at their asylum claims here in the UK. Well, refugee rights groups are saying that there is nothing illegal about arriving here in the UK through any means. The United Nations has also cast doubts on the proposals. The government here is saying that other governments will have a moral duty to cooperate, but lots of critics are pointing out that A, they won't be minded to, and after Brexit, the government here does not have a right to send back refugees to the first EU country they arrived in, and they're pointing out that it's the government's own moral duty to process asylum seekers of everyone who arrives on these shores. It's not legislation yet, so we don't know how far the government will push these controversial plans. Nadeem Baba for Inside Story.
Let's bring in our guests now. In London, John Campbell, Emeritus Reader of Anthropology and Law, SOAS University of London. In Brussels, Catherine Woollard, Secretary General at the European Council on Refugees and Exiles. In Oxford, Peter Walsh, a researcher in migration at Oxford University's Migration Observatory. Welcome to the program. John, the UK has always had laws governing migrants, refugees and asylum seekers. Now the government is talking about the biggest overhaul in asylum system. Why now?
Why now is because of Brexit. Once the Brexit went into effect on the end of December, the United Kingdom is no longer able to use the returns directive for the EU or the Dublin transfers. So the result is that they're unable to deal with failed asylum seekers. Okay.
Catherine, the first reactions we got from different human rights activists, refugees, agencies worldwide is this is a divisive, unfair law. How do you see it?
There are many problematic elements. At first sight, it does appear to contravene the Refugee Convention of 1951, as UNHCR has also highlighted. The convention states quite clearly that people who arrive illegally, so-called, should not be penalised, or a state may not impose penalties. I think it's welcome that the UK is trying to increase resettlement places, because refugees themselves and those of us working on the right to asylum argue strongly for safe and legal routes to reach protection. However, that can't be a substitute for arriving. It's not illegal to cross a border to seek protection. It's a fundamental right, and that's just the nature of forced displacement. So that element in particular is very problematic.
Peter, the two basic laws governing the issue of migrants, refugees and asylum seekers are the 1971 Act and the immigration rules. Now, when you look at the numbers of the flow of migrants into the UK, it's not really high compared to the 10, 15 years ago. And this is leading many people to think this is a politically motivated decision by the government to show their own people that, you know what, we're now delivering a promise to take a tougher stance when it comes to people coming into our country.
That's a very position, because when we look at asylum seeking in the UK and we compare the numbers now, they're actually a third of what they were 20 years ago. At the turn of the millennium, we had over 100,000 people claiming asylum in the UK per year. Now it's between 30 and 40,000. And we know that last year, there were about 35,000 people that claimed asylum in the UK, and that was down 20% on the previous year, 2019. So for the UK, numbers are down. When we broaden that and compare those numbers internationally, then the numbers look even smaller. The UK has accepted claims of between 30 and 40,000 in the last few years. Other EU countries, like Italy, like Spain, like France, and especially Germany, have taken many tens of thousands more applications and many tens of thousands more refugees. So in international comparison, the UK doesn't fare so well in the asylum that it grants to these people.
John,
may I interject?
Please go ahead. Go ahead, Catherine.
This comes back to your first question, moderator, which was about why now. For those of us outside the UK, it does seem like a mystery, in the sense that the number of asylum seekers is at a historical low, as just described, and a clear majority of those arriving in the UK are refugees. So this is very much a manageable caseload. But instead of investing in the asylum system and speeding up decision-making, for instance, of these people, most of whom are refugees, the UK is sort of going down the route of sort of fantasy options of trying to prevent people arriving, or indeed trying to convince another country to do external processing of asylum claims, ideas that come up from time to time and that never work.
John, now one of the controversial aspects of the new reform is basically this whole notion about asylum seekers filling in the applications, entering the UK legally for their own applications to be processed and their chances for staying in the UK to be higher. But in reality, you know, and everybody knows, this is not the way it works. People are fleeing the persecution, threat, danger. They're looking for freedom, safety of their own life. And most of the time, 90% of the cases, they have to cross illegally because this is the only way available to them.
Yes, that's correct. The United Kingdom and the European Union, also to be fair, have closed off possible legal entry routes for seeking asylum. And the most obvious sign of this is the pushbacks on the eastern borders of the European Union, but also the boats sinking in the Mediterranean as refugees are leaving Libya and North Africa.
Peter, now the case is basically going to be the following. You arrive illegally, you will be removed. Sent where? Do we have any idea? Is it going to be an offshore facility like the Australians did in the past?
Well, that is the big question. Previously, there was a possibility before Brexit when the UK was a part of the Dublin scheme, and that allowed us to transfer asylum seekers to other EU member states. Now we're no longer a part of the EU. We can't avail ourselves of that scheme. Instead, to return asylum seekers to other safe countries, we will have to enter into bespoke agreements, bilateral agreements with those specific countries or with the EU as a whole. And so far, there have been very few indications that progress has been made on those kinds of agreements. Historically, we know that diplomatically, those agreements are very difficult to hammer out because countries do not want to accept more asylum seekers. So the big question is, where can we return them? You mentioned the idea of offshore processing. There were two places mentioned last week, Gibraltar and the Isle of Man. The leaders in those places have said they were not even consulted. So there are really big questions about where these asylum seekers can be returned to.
And John, this is creating some concerns among many people all over the world, which is basically the notion that in the meantime, if the cases are going to be processed by the British government, we're most likely going to have to deal with where to send those people. Are they going to stay in temporary shelters, former military bases, overseas? And what happens in that in between?
Well, the United Kingdom is obligated to, under the Refugee Convention, to treat these asylum seekers fairly. What's happened in the past months because of COVID has been that thousands of people have been housed in hotels or military barracks across the United Kingdom. And there are serious problems that have arisen from there, including infections by COVID, but also inability to access their lawyers to make an asylum claim. So this is clearly a problem which the Home Office failed to foresee. and because of its reliance on shifting asylum applicants out to other regions outside of London, where they're relying upon private providers of housing.
Catherine, after the incident where the largest refugee camp in Greece was ripped, was destroyed by fire, there was a growing debate in the EU, in particular, about the need to stop this whole idea about refugee camps, old barracks, where we should be relocating immigrants. And it's about time to rethink the whole strategy. It doesn't seem to be the case in the UK now.
I think what applies to the UK also applies to the rest of Europe and to the European Union countries, in that there are standards in law for provision of decent reception conditions for people who've applied to asylum. So for asylums, often it's a case of just implementing those standards that already exist. And I think with what we're seeing in the UK, the subject of our discussion now, some of these measures are also counterproductive, because if people are eventually granted asylum, then their integration prospects are hindered by having been detained in substandard conditions for sometimes long periods of time. I think similarly, one of the headline measures that Priti Patel has just introduced, saying that people who arrive illegally, although we don't like this term because it's not illegal to cross a border to seek protection, but people who arrive irregularly may then have more precarious status, and they won't be guaranteed the permanent right to stay. They'll have to reapply for their status. Those measures also dramatically undermine integration outcomes, as well as creating great stress and suffering for people who've already been traumatized because they're recognized as refugees. I think it's part of the attempt by the UK to create a culture of deterrence, but there's no pull factor drawing people to the UK. These are push factors in the places that they're from.
Peter, it's all about meeting some sort of benchmarks for any asylum seeker to be accepted into the UK. However, if you look at the provisions that are now being proposed, one of them says that the law targets those who are travelling through a safe country. Let's say that you have decided for a political reason to leave your country, you've been smuggled into France, for example, and then from France you decide to go to the UK. The UK government is going to say, well, you know what, France is a safe country, you should have stayed in France, therefore you will be removed. Why are we punishing people just for this transit when the ideal would have been to cooperate between the French and the UK to sort out this whole problem?
That's a very good question. And the reality is there is nothing in the Refugee Convention that obliges asylum seekers to claim asylum in the first country in which they arrive. A really important point as well to bear in mind, this is a very important point that's central to this debate, is that there really are no ways of claiming asylum in the UK legally. And that's for the simple reason that to claim asylum in the UK, you first have to reach the UK. There's no asylum visa. So what you must either do is arrive clandestinely, perhaps by small boat crossing the English Channel, or by stowing away on a lorry, or by coming to the UK on a visa for some other purpose, such as a student visa or tourism, and then claiming asylum when you arrive. Now, that will necessarily involve deception of the authorities regarding the purpose of the move to the UK. And so that is also technically illegal. So the big question is, what are the legal routes to which Priti Patel is referring? We have not seen the details yet.
John, this is a brave new world. In the 60s and the 70s, Europe was very compassionate in reaching out to people all over the world. Now there is this whole idea that migrants are a danger to Western democracy. The xenophobic rhetoric has been prevailing. Do you see that as one of the main reasons why we are now targeting asylum seekers, migrants, particularly in Europe?
Yes, it's clearly an issue, and it's one that's been of growing concern. But it's allied with a number of other conservative concerns about the integrity of national citizens, the maintenance of benefits and other rights for citizens, a whole host of other issues which have never in the United Kingdom actually been openly discussed and debated. So what we're getting is a movement towards an increasingly conservative and restrictive agenda here in the United Kingdom towards refugees. And it's one which is closing down possibilities for asylum and for integration, as the other speakers have noted.
Catherine, the UK is saying that it is championing human rights, democracy and the rights of people who are seeking asylum to be respected. What you see, on the other hand, is this disconnect. On one hand, you say this, on the other, you're erecting fences, you're deporting people just for this because they are not meeting those benchmarks. Human rights activists and refugees agencies all over the world, what can they do internationally to rally international support for those people?
I think we have to also contextualise this, because the UK's approach is based on so many myths, and not least the idea that there's disproportionate responsibility being taken up by Europe. It's not the case. 80 million people are forcibly displaced, and the vast majority of them, 90%, are in developing countries, and in many cases in the same major refugee hosting countries. So I think it's also about shifting the narrative and explaining the reality of displacement and who is actually supporting people. And I think we also need to counter the argument that what the UK government is doing here is compliant and in conformity with international law, which is not the case, as we've discussed during this programme. So the idea of, I think, global responsibility sharing is key, and that means every country should be doing its part. There is a sort of paradox in the UK and in the rest of Europe, though. As you say, there is this increasing hostility in the political sphere, but public opinion historically is becoming more and more open. If we compare public opinion now to public opinion in the 70s, for instance, there's greater support both for offering protection to refugees, but also to immigration more widely.
Right.
So I think our political leaders need to get in step with their publics.
Peter, isn't this reform a breach of international law?
That's not really for me to say, but it is true that serious questions have been raised about its compatibility with the UN Refugee Convention of 1951, in particular Article 31, which states quite clearly migrants who arrive illegally, if they come directly from a territory where their life or freedom is threatened and present themselves in good time, that should not prejudice their asylum application. So the lawyers will be very keen to get a hold of the technical legal detail of these proposals, and then we'll be able to have an idea of whether there is a direct contravention of our international treaty.
You're absolutely right when you talk about those technical procedures that lawyers will have to look into to decide whether this is going to be a breach of international law or not. But John, when you look at this whole debate, there is a difference between substantiating the claim for asylum and the other fact, which is when you look at those pages about those people, underneath somehow, somewhere are buried the names of people who have decided to leave the country because they have been persecuted politically, ethnically, or religiously. And because of this debate and because of these reforms, they are most likely going to be sent back home. Sending them back home could mean death for many of them. And this is what is lost in this whole debate, politically speaking, in the UK government.
Yes, you're right. But what the current proposals by Priti Patel are suggesting is a form that will make asylum seekers endure even more problems if indeed we follow the Australian position of offshoring refugees, as they are now doing in Papua New Guinea and in the island of Nauru. In fact, it is incredibly expensive to do this. So that there is a number of problems with this entire proposal. One, it may be illegal. It probably is illegal. Two, it is extremely expensive. Last year, the Australians spent 1.2 billion Australian dollars to maintain its offshoring possibility. Mm-hmm. That was only detaining 300 refugees at the time. Right, so the cost is tremendous. So that would have been an expenditure of 4 million Australian dollars per person detained at that time. Mm-hmm. At the same time, there are numerous problems with the system not being compliant with human rights obligations. So, for example, there was inadequate and unhygienic living conditions. There was reports of sexual and physical abuse by staff at these detention centers. Mm-hmm. There were inadequate medical and psychological treatment, etc. There's a lot of problems with any attempt to offshore.
In a minute, Catherine, please go ahead. Very, very briefly,
yes,
if you don't
I was
mind.
simply going to add that one of the main obstacles to that idea is also the political obstacle, in that no country wants to accept hosting such centres. And indeed, perennially, these ideas are proposed. In the UK debate in 2003, Tony Blair and the new Labour government of that time was putting forward similar proposals, and they usually stumble on this issue that no country is willing to host.
Okay. Peter, with the 2015 exodus of migrants into Europe, you remember the debate was about the need to restart and reset the policy, and they were all talking about an effective humanitarian and safe policy among EU nations. We're doing this debate about the UK, and this is going to give us an indication that they haven't moved any inch towards establishing those goals.
That's right. Those talks have stalled, and now that the UK is out of the EU, it won't be party to that future system other than by developing these new bilateral agreements, which, as we have seen historically, diplomatically, a very tough task indeed. So it's really not clear exactly where the UK is moving on asylum, but it seems to be ever further away from the policy ideas that are popular on the European mainland and in the EU.
And I'm sure the debate will continue between those who say that these are issues of national security and those who will continue to say this is the right for everyone to live a better life in a better world. John Campbell, Catherine Woollard and Peter Walsh, thank you. Thank you for your insight and thank you for your time. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com, for further discussion. Go to our Facebook page, that's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Hashem Ahelbarra, and the entire team here in Doha. Bye for now.